We might be unblocked now. Okay, as a matter of review, this is on your paper. I want you to pick up your paper and take a good look at this, because there was a couple of things that we need to follow through. The great vision that we've seen here in chapter 12, verse 1, he says it's a great wonder, that is the woman, the child, and the dragon, was in chapter 12. Remember that? Chapter 13 is going to be Satan's kingdom and human sin at its fullest. This is all part of the vision. Chapter 12, 13, and 14. There's so much included in there, but we always have to remember, this is not like the former parts in the book of Revelation or the latter parts. This is a vision, chapter 12, 13, and 14, that John has that kind of puts everything in, God's taking everything in a panoramic view, theatrical play, some may say, or parentheses in the middle of the book that gives a little bit of a description before, during, and after this time. Because we're going to see things like the Antichrist, we're going to see 666, we're going to see the beast from the sea and the beast from the land, which is going to be the false prophet, and then we're going to find the dragon coming. Oh, I'm sorry, Phil. I forgot to give you one. You get one for Karen too?
This year.
Okay. So we find that this vision that starts here in Revelation chapter 12, verse 1, remember, as we're going through chapter 12, 13, and 14, this is all within the same vision, okay, he's having. And it's not, before this, we had the seal judgments, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then we went to trumpet judgments, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. When we got to the 7th trumpet judgment, that's when this gets interposed into the book of Revelation, okay? So it's not, you can't say this is exactly after trumpet 7, but it's a panoramic view of what is happening during the tribulation time period, okay? I kind of give it a little bit of, as we looked at Revelation chapter 12, look under in A, number 1, last week's lesson, the woman represented Israel. This is so critically important for us to understand that. Remember, I gave you the passage from Genesis where Jacob was talking about the 11 stars around, and Joseph was, that's a clear indication. So he's talking about the nation of Israel here. And this is basic. This is 101. We have to get a handle on that, because everything else is going to build on that. Because Israel is the key. It's always been the key, and it will continue to be the key. And he gives us, the woman is a representative of Israel. And you know how I mentioned various fellas will say it's Mary, because you're going to have the Christ child. And in God's government, it's never, Mary is never exalted. And I use that word exalted for a reason. She's never exalted above the rest of us. She, you know, Christ died for her sin too. So she is in Revelation chapter 12, she is pictured as Israel is pictured as the woman that brings forth the Christ child. Israel, not Mary. It's Israel brings forth the Christ child. So that's important for us to understand, okay? The dragon represents Satan. Of course, it says so in verse 9 and down in verse 3 and 4. And the child represents Jesus. Everybody was pretty in agreement with that. There was open discussion then. And this is where we got into some stuff about grafted in and grafted out and all that kind of stuff. This comes from the passage, I think, that leads us to a lot of explanation of this, is Romans chapter 11. And I thought, okay, I'll pick out a couple of verses here. you can't really pick out a couple of verses. It's the whole thing in Romans 11. It's extremely important. How Paul, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, how he sees Israel and how he sees the church, and how they're separated, and how God is using them. So that's why I think this lesson today is probably going to bleed on over into next week. This is going to be a 2-week lesson thing, because we're going to go through Romans.
We're not here next week.
Yeah, I'll be here.
I thought you were tomorrow.
Yeah, I was, but Andrea said she didn't want us to stay down there very long, so.
I thought it was the fourth, he's leaving.
Yeah, I thought the fourth Sunday, I always said something going on.
No, that's the fifth Sunday, No, I'll be here next week, so if you're, so we've got 5 weeks coming this week before Christmas break, so 5 more weeks of Dad's jokes. Okay. Romans chapter 11, take a look at this. We're going to read all the way from, and do some comments as we go along. It's very important that we get a handle on this, because we're talking about Israel here in Revelation 12. So we got to kind of get a handle on what is Israel as far as what Paul is seeing in Romans chapter 11. Okay? Because it's going to dovetail together, the pieces. And I will tell you, when you're at home doing stuff and you want to study some stuff that's pretty heavy, go to Romans 11 and look this up and just follow through this, okay? Okay, Paul starts, everybody ready? Paul starts out, I say then, has God cast away his people? God forbid. For I also am an Israelite, of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. What people is he talking about casting away? It's Israel, isn't it? It's not talking about the church. Has God cast away his people? He's talking about Israel, because he says, I was a Benjamite. I'm of the tribe of Israel. And so he's obviously talking about Israel. God has not cast away his people, which he foreknew. What he not, that the scripture saith in Isaiah, how he maketh intercession to God against Israel. He says, well, haven't you ever read this, where it says in the Old Testament that, Isaiah was making an accusation against Israel? He says, you should read this. He says, and he quotes Isaiah, he says, Lord, they have killed thy prophets and digged down thine altar, and I am left alone, and they seek my life. But what saith the answer of God unto him? I have reserved unto me 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to the image of Baal. Now, what's that, Isaiah? Elijah. That's Elijah said that. Lord, I'm the only prophet left. And the Lord says, get off your butt. You aren't the only one. I've got 7,000 Israelites that are for me, that are on my side. Now, you think back at that story, remember that story in the Old Testament where he puts the stuff on the altar and they dump water on it, and God sends fire from heaven and burns it up. Right after that, the King Jezebel says, I'm going to have your head before the sun is down, and Elijah turns around and runs and goes all the way over to Mount Carmel, and he's over there, and he says, Lord, just kill me, I'm the only one left. Nobody else cares. You ever been in that kind of, Lord, I think I'm the only Christian left. I think my family, my church, my home, I'm the only one that's really following. Lord, what is it? Why? And God says, get up. I've got 7,000 that have not bowed their knee to you, to Baal. So God is telling him, and he tells us through that story that God's reserved a remnant. It's not a big one, but there's 7,000. Now, if I'm an Israelite living back then, there may have been 500,000 people. And God says, I got 7,000. That would probably make you think, that ain't a whole lot of people, Lord. You haven't given a whole lot. But God knows exactly the number. And isn't it great to know that you can be part of a remnant that is very small, but God noticed. Very small. And we are. We are a remnant that's very small. Okay, let's read on. Verse 4. We got to go all the way down to verse 31. So you see why I said it's going to take a while. Okay, and raise your hand if you want to interject anything here. Even so then, verse 5, even so then at this present time also there is a remnant according to the election of grace. And if by grace, then is it no more of works? Otherwise grace is no more grace. But if it be works, then it is no more grace. Otherwise work is no more work. So he says, okay, there is, even at this time, there are some of these Jewish people that have accepted Christ and the grace that he offers them. What then? Israel, verse 7, what then? Israel has not obtained that which he seeketh for. Israel was looking for justification by keeping the law. And he says they have not received that thing that they were looking for. They were looking for justification before God by keeping the law. Okay? But the election has obtained it, and the rest were blinded, according as it is written, God hath given to them the spirit of slumber, eyes that they should not see, and ears that they should not hear, unto this day. So, because Israel wanted to create their own righteousness before God by saying, I keep the law, I keep the Sabbath, I do all of the different things, I am right before God. Because they wanted that, and they wouldn't come under the grace of God, where they recognize, I'm a sinner, I have no opportunity for salvation. There's nothing God gets if he gets me. But I'm calling upon his grace to forgive me. They didn't want to go that way. They wanted to present to God their righteousness. And he says they failed because they wanted to bring their own righteousness. Okay? Now, let's get on to verse 9. And David saith, now he's going to give us another example from David. And David saith, let their table be made a snare and a trap and a stumbling block and a recompense upon them. Let their eyes be darkened that they may not see, and bow down their back always. In other words, Lord, they don't care about grace. Let them be destroyed. Let their nation be destroyed. Let them bow down in persecution. Okay, and this is as far as Hitler got. Hitler said right here, we need to kill them all because their backs should be bent down, and that's why they put them in concentration camps where they put them in forced labor with no food, no water, so their backs would be bent down. Hitler got this far. He didn't read any of the rest of it, okay? I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? God forbid. God didn't say, I want them to fall. But rather, through their fall, salvation is come unto the Gentiles, for to provoke them to jealousy. So God's intent is that the Jew would get jealous of the fact that God is showing grace to the Gentiles and we have received salvation, and they would get jealous and say, I wish I could get that. God was in this whole plan trying to create jealousy, and it's worked by some, trying to create jealousy on the Jews' part when they see us. By the way, is anybody here Jewish? I think everybody here is Gentile, right? So when they see us, they should be jealous. Oh man, these people actually follow the same Yahweh, the same God that we follow. And they do it with joy, and they seem to have, purpose in life. But the Jew, on the other hand, he's over here and he's getting jealous of us. And God's creating that jealousy. When you're jealous of somebody, you probably want to go get what they got, right? So that's what God's doing. He's creating jealousy in the nation of Israel. Verse 12, for if the fall of them be the riches of the world, and the diminishing of them the riches of the Gentile, how much more their fullness. Now he's switching a little bit here. He says, if the fall of the Jews from grace and being able to receive grace, if their fall has caused riches on the Gentiles, then he says, what would their fullness be? So in other words, if God brought them back to their fullness, what would that do to the Gentiles? Okay, so he's painting a picture here. Okay, he's going to flesh this out a little bit. Verse 13. For I speak to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I am an apostle to the Gentiles. Was Paul a Jew or a Gentile?
Jew.
He was Jew, but he was an apostle to the Gentiles. Okay? He says, for I speak unto you Gentiles, inasmuch as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my office. His office was to the Gentiles. He's saying, I'm going to show you, I'm going to display, magnify my office. Okay? For if the casting away of them be the reconciling of the world, what shall the receiving of them but life from the dead? Here again, he talks about the receiving of Israel. So he says, if they got cast away and the Gentile world got blessed greatly, what would the receiving of the Jews do to the rest of the world? It would be a great blessing, wouldn't it? That's what he's showing both sides of this, okay? For if the first fruit be holy, the lump is also holy, and if the root, and remember that root, and if the root be holy, so are the branches. What is the root he's referring to here?
We're grafted in.
It's not the branches. The branches are the Jews and the Gentiles. What's the root?
Christ is the root.
Christ is the
Grafted
root.
in.
Salvation is the root. The Bible is the root. God's grace is the root. That's the root from which Israel was a branch from. And God is going to break them off. But he's making a statement here that the root is holy. The root never changes. He's going to be talking about branches being broke off, but the root stays holy. Okay? And the first fruits of the branch are holy. And then he goes on in verse 17, and if some of the branches be broken off, and thou be a wild olive tree, wert grafted in among them, and with them partakers of the root and the fatness of the olive tree. So in other words, if I was to have this rootstock, and I break off some of the branches on this olive tree, and I graft in branches from a wild olive tree, then they both partake of the root, don't they? They both are given life by the root. He's using that analogy. Us as the wild olive tree. We are not of the nation of Israel, but the nation of Israel was the original branches that God broke off. Now, he doesn't say he broke off all the branches. He broke off some of Israel's branches. And so that's interesting when we see that we still see Jewish people that get saved. Not many, but some. There's some that are still part of the root. They believed in the root. They follow the root. The Gentiles that have been grafted in from a wild olive tree. You know, if we could go back several generations and look at our genealogy, we might say, hey, I got some wild people in my family. There's some horse thieves, there's some, very immoral people. There's anybody got any perfect lineage? I can think of myself, my goodness. Yeah. We were a wild olive tree. Okay, now in verse 18 he says, boast not against the branches. In other words, don't say, we're better than them Jews. I'm better because I'm boasting against them. Don't boast against the branches. But if thou boast, thou bearest not the root, but the root thee. So Don't boast about branches being broke off and you being brought in. Boast about the fact that you are part of the root. That's where the real point is. It's not that, we're better than the Jews. It's that we're partaking of the same root that they used to be part of. And we don't put them down because they are no longer part of the root. We don't boast against them. Okay? Verse 19. Thou wilt say then, the branches were broken off, that I might be grafted in. That would be a pretty reasonable statement for a Christian to say, well, God got rid of the Jews so that us Gentiles could get in, right? Well, because of unbelief, they were broken off, verse 20. And thou standest by faith, be not high-minded, but fear. Fear. I've been grafted into Christ. Why should I fear? He puts the thing, fear. And then he says in verse 21, for if God spared not the natural branches, take heed that lest he also spare not thee. Ooh, that's serious stuff. He's saying, look, don't boast about being a Gentile and the Jews being kicked out, and because of that, we got grafted in. Boast about the fact that you're part of this rootstock because God can remove you from the rootstock, just like he did them. He can break off that branch that was a wild olive tree that was grafted in. He can break that back off. So we need to look at that, okay? He says in verse 22, behold therefore the goodness and severity of God on them which fell severity, but towards thee goodness. If thou continue in this goodness, otherwise thou also shalt be cut off. This is very sobering to a Christian. When we stop and think, the day may come because of my lack of following the Lord and my unwillingness to be used of him, he says, I'm going to break your ministry off. Break it off. That's why he says in 1 John, we will know that we know him if we keep his commandments. If we don't keep his commandments, we will not know that we know him. We will have been broke off from the rootstock and will no longer be getting our sustenance. We're still saved because we're saved by God's grace, but our usefulness is useless. It's gone. We have no, and that's the play on the words here. Any questions about that? This is heavy. He's getting heavy.
Because he's talking about the nation,
Yep.
maybe the breaking off is other nations, like the United States is turning back on
Yeah,
God,
maybe.
and the blessing is good.
Yep. He can break off. Yeah, it could refer to the nations, could be referred to a church, could be referred to a Christian. That God's judgment is, he's looking across. You've been grafted in as a wild olive tree into the rootstock that's holy. And, well, take the nation of America. You go back a couple hundred years, I remember hearing about different circuit riders, guys that did the traveling preachers and evangelists, come to town, whole town shuts down. Whole town shuts down and everybody comes to hear the preacher because he's the traveling minister. Today, if you're a traveling minister, you come to Clio, you'll be hard pressed to get two people to come listen to you. But they feared God then. And I wonder if God hasn't already broke off America and, put us in a position of not receiving his blessings because of it. But a Christian also. Okay?
I thought
Questions?
about that. Well, I thought about that, we can hear the voice of God. It's a soft voice that speaks to us. And he can turn where we cannot hear his voice no more.
Yeah.
And I thought too, there's a verse in the Bible that speaks about the reprobate mind, that he sends you over to a reprobate mind because you're unwilling and you're stubborn and stiff, of not wanting to respond or be obedient.
That's exactly the part, in Romans 1. He turns them over to a reprobate mind, do those things which are unseemly.
Yes.
Because they were not thankful and they did not relate to God and put him forth in their life. That's speaking specifically of an individual. But I think it also goes for churches and countries and nations, that God. So when we're talking about breaking off branches and everything, remember we talked about that a little bit last week? I'm just trying to flesh this out. This is where it comes from. Verse 23. And they also, if they abide not still in unbelief, so if Israel no longer abides in unbelief, shall be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. So Israel, if they no longer abide in unbelief, they can be grafted back in again. Okay? Think of what happened to the nation of Israel that showed that God was no longer protecting them and they were broke off. Think of AD 70. Titus coming to Israel, destroying the temple, killing 1.5 million Jews, taking most of the ones that were left, putting them into slavery and scattering them throughout the world. And Israel ceased to be a nation. AD 70. Titus, the Roman emperor, he was to be the emperor, he was a general at that time. That was kind of the turning point when we could see a clear breaking away. God wasn't doing the same stuff he did in the Old Testament, protecting them and their enemies are fleeing and everything. No. Titus surrounded Jerusalem, starved out those that were there. Those that were still left to fight were fighting amongst themselves. When the temple was when the wall was breached and they came to the temple, and the Jews said, we're not going to let the temple burn. This is God's temple. We won't. And it says, perchance, Josephus tells us, that a Roman soldier threw in a burning torch into the temple, and the temple immediately exploded with flames. Immediately exploded. And the Jews, the zealous Jews, ran into the temple by the hundreds and burned to death because they did not want to see the temple die and Judaism die. That was in AD 70. Jesus died and was buried and rose again in AD 33. So this is a few years later when the branches actually broke off. Now, we're going to see later on, he's going to make a statement about Israel is going to be entirely saved. Okay, let's read on. Verse 25. For I would not, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own conceits, that blindness in part is happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. He's given us a time here, a date. He says, when the fullness of the Gentiles comes in, then Israel will no longer be blinded. Now, we sit and think, when will the fullness of the Gentiles come in? What is he referring to there? I think it's a reference to the rapture. And when the rapture happens, the Gentile church, and I know there's Jewish people too, the Gentile church is raptured and removed from this earth. So Israel is left as the only witness for the Lord. And the Gentile time period that we're waiting for it to come in is going to be the rapture. Ronna?
Okay, so at that time, you say the Jews will be the only witness through the tribulation.
Well,
You say all Jews will be saved. I mean, do you think they'll all come to know Christ at that time?
let's read on. See what does Paul say? In verse 26, and so all Israel shall be saved.
That's if they accept Christ as their Savior.
You says, all Israel shall be saved. There shall come out of Zion a deliverer, and shall turn away ungodliness from Jacob. There's coming a day when all Israel, and